My name is Dominic Deli Carpini. I am the Dean of the York College Center for Community Engagement, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of our series on Foundations of Democracy. Uh, like all academic institutions, we like to view things from a variety of perspectives. Yesterday, I was able to talk a little bit about the relationship between democracy and rhetoric and the ways in which we discourse with one another. Um, Tomorrow, we will be hearing from one of our history professors and a scholar on issues related to fascism, as well as to the rise of the Nazis in Germany. And on Thursday, we'll be hearing from Vinnie Cannizzaro, the director of our Glatfelter Institute on Public Policy, about relationship between democracy and power. So we are today really happy to have my colleague, Dr. Randi Shedlosky-Shoemaker, who is a trained social psychologist, and she has a research focus on social cognition and intergroup relations. In the York College Psychology Department, she teaches courses on multicultural awareness, on intimate relationships, and critical thinking and writing. She also serves on the General Education and Assessment Committee for the college, where she advocates for addressing cultural awareness throughout the curriculum. And I'll say she's also chair of our Long Range Planning Committee. So Randi has many roles here at the college, but today we get to hear Randi talk about her research area, or one of her research areas, and to kind of add another lens to what we talked about yesterday, which is how is it that we critically think together, this time from a psychological perspective. So I'm going to turn it over to Randi at this point. Thank you for being here today, Randi.
Thanks, Dominic. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I've been teaching during the winter term, and my students have told me sometimes my video goes a little weird, but otherwise my audio is okay. So hopefully Zoom sticks with us. So as Dominic said, today I'm going to be presenting a psychological perspective on democracy, specifically in terms of the relationship with our ego and our tendency to want to protect our ego. So to get started, I figured it was worth, there we go, just pausing for a moment and thinking about what we mean by critical thinker. Now, this model you can see up here, this is actually a model I learned way back in undergrad that has nothing to do with critical thinking. This model, the elaboration likelihood model, was proposed by Petio and Cacioppo and speaks to persuasion. And the idea behind their model is that we are going to frame our persuasive messages differently if we have an audience who's not thinking much, so low in elaboration, as compared to thinking a lot or high in elaboration, or anywhere in between. Their basic suggestion was that if I have an audience who is investing in a lot of thought, so high elaboration, I am going to try and persuade them using strong arguments, credible sources. On the other hand, if I have an audience who perhaps is not thinking as much as I would like them to be, then I'm going to use what I like to call the shiny stuff. We use cues and heuristics to try and sway their attitudes. Now, since teaching social psychology, I think I've been teaching it for many years, probably 10 to 12 years at this point. At some point in that history of teaching this model as a persuasion model, it occurred to me that this model can help us understand what a critical thinker looks like. It's a model that tells us that our level of thought, elaboration, critical thinking, however we want to call it, can vary from low to high, anywhere in between. And it also tells us that there are two general variables that can help us understand why someone might be high or low on this continuum. The first is ability. So these are just some of the factors that might contribute to a higher or lower ability. If I have more knowledge, more expertise, more information about a topic, it's going to be easier for me to engage in higher levels of thought. In comparison, if I have time constraints or if I am facing distractions, that's going to make it a lot harder for me to engage in critical thinking. But ability is only one of those variables that can affect my position on this continuum. The one I'm more interested in is the variable of motivation. There are going to be some cases where we are simply more motivated to think about a situation. On the other hand, there's going to be cases where we are less motivated. So let's think about that. Why might we not want to think critically? The most obvious, we're lazy. Sometimes we just don't want to put in the effort because maybe we've got other things going on. We just don't have the energy levels. Maybe it's been a long week or a long month or a long year, and we just do not have the desire to think critically in that moment. But there's this other factor that I have noticed in my teaching, particularly as I try to teach people about cultural competency. There is this tendency to really want to protect what we already know. And it makes sense that we are going to want to do this. It feels very validating. It feels really good when we're right. So if I can protect what I already know, that tells me that I'm right. I got the correct answer. I feel good about myself. On the other hand, if we start thinking about how it feels to be wrong, or more specifically, how it feels to realize we're wrong, I'm sure a lot of you would agree, it doesn't feel good. We feel disappointed in ourselves. We feel guilty. We generally feel like we're bad people if we have gotten something wrong. So this keeps us all very motivated to not face those moments of wrongness. And it turns out we have a lot of techniques to help us preserve what we know and ignore those feelings of wrongness. This is a long list, and sadly, I could have kept going, but for the sake of time, these are going to be the ones I kind of focus on. All of these really revolve around this idea of protecting and preserving what we already know. In that way, they kind of remind me of being on a treadmill. So maybe this would be a light jog, maybe it's just a light, slow walk. But when you're on a treadmill, you are exerting some level of effort. Probably not too much if it's just a light jog or a slow walk. And the thing is, you can spend hours on that treadmill putting any level of effort into movement, and yet you will have gone nowhere. So a lot of these techniques have that same effect. They do require us to do something, but that something gets us absolutely nowhere. So if we think about, for instance, the belief perseverance effect, this tendency to cling to what we already know in the face of new information or in the face of contradictory information. That belief perseverance effect actually is fed by a lot of other strategies. And in fact, I saw one of the participants bring up the idea of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is a great technique that humans use quite frequently, where we spend time looking for information that proves us right or confirms our existing belief. And we spend time avoiding what might prove us wrong or what might disconfirm our beliefs. And if we can't avoid that information, we dismiss it, we discredit it. We suggest that it's not valid, it's not reliable, it's absolutely fake. So that way we don't have to confront that maybe this information would suggest we're wrong. Similar to the confirmation bias is our tendency to engage in what's called assimilation. So I'm going to step back a little bit and just explain what assimilation is. For those who aren't familiar with this strategy, Piaget, a developmental psychologist who looked at how humans develop cognitive strategies throughout their lifespan, suggested we generally have one of two directions we can go when faced with new information. When we have a new experience, we can figure out how it fits with our existing beliefs and just assimilate it, smash it in to what we already know. We could also look at this new information, look at this new experience, compare it to what we already know and say, this doesn't quite fit. I'm going to have to change or accommodate what I already know to fit this new experience. Now, if you think about those two strategies, assimilation, where I take new information and just cram it into my existing belief structure so I don't have to change, or accommodation, where I actually have to change my existing belief structure to fit the new experience, think, which one sounds easier? Assimilation, right? Not surprisingly, assimilation is what people tend to do when faced with a new experience, especially if that experience is somewhat ambiguous, which, let's be fair, most experiences are fairly ambiguous. We take that new experience, that new information, and we mold it and shape it in a way that supports the existing belief structure. That way, we don't have to make changes. In a similar kind of mindset, we have what's called the anchoring bias, where we kind of get stuck. Once I've been faced with some initial information, very early on in facing that initial information, we tend to make decisions. We tend to start developing feelings, attitudes that, this is what I want to do. This is not what I want to do. This is good. This is bad. And as new information comes in, we may consider that new information, but we very rarely actually give it the weight or the credit that it deserves. So in that way, we see the initial information, we toss out the anchor from the boat, and we're able to kind of float towards that new information, but we're still pretty stuck in that initial mindset, that initial perception or judgment that we formed early on. Similarly, we tend to get stuck in our strategy. So it's not just about getting stuck in early decision making. We tend to have a habit of engaging in what are called mental sets. So mental set is a tendency to look at a strategy and say, well, it's worked for me in the past, so I'm going to keep on using that. I like to pick on this one a little bit and call it the "that's the way we've always done it" bias. Likely you've heard that before, right? You question, why do we do it this way? Why is this particular strategy the one we're opting for? And invariably someone in the crowd just declares, well, don't question it. It's the way we've always done it. We do tend to get very committed to a small subset of strategies that is particularly useful or has been particularly useful in the past. And that keeps us from seeing new strategies, new solutions that actually might be more effective or more useful. I just saw a panelist had suggested too, the idea of appealing to tradition fallacy works very well with that mental set. And I love, there's kind of this language issue that my students, of course, in class get super frustrated with when they're like, but wait, it's about the same thing. I'm like, yeah. So this is what cognitive psychologists call it, as compared to people outside of cognitive psychology might call it something else. So those mental sets, that idea of appealing to tradition, that we're like, no, tradition's the way we've always done it. We're not going to consider that there might be a new strategy. Now, what a lot of these strategies so far have the habit of doing or have the effect of doing is making certain information more readily available for us. And that leads us into the availability heuristic. So if I have certain habits, certain strategies that I've always used, certain information that I constantly surround myself with and constantly see in those echo chambers, that information, those strategies, well, they pop to mind quickly. When I'm trying to make decisions, that's going to be the information that is readily available for me. And what we know based on the availability heuristic is that when something is easy for us to think of, we assume that means it's the right information. It's the correct information. So we don't necessarily consider that there's things we're overlooking. There's information that's less readily available, that's equally as valid, equally as useful, but just less accessible to us or less available to us in that moment, which actually gets us into the saliency bias. So when I'm trying to explain what's happening, so I'm trying to make what we call in social psychology an attribution, trying to explain the cause of a behavior. We have this tendency to look for what is most obvious or what is most salient to us. So if I see someone giving a talk and they're up there, they seem nervous, they're kind of stumbling over the cards, they look unprepared to me as the observer. In that situation, what is most salient is their lack of preparation. In reality, their nervousness could have something to do with the fact that they struggle with social anxiety, or the fact that maybe they were up all night trying to help a friend talk a friend through a difficult situation. And so they're exhausted and confused. When we are engaging in that process of attribution, we tend not to look for things that are subtle. We look for what's obvious, and we use that obvious, readily available information in our decision making, even though that obvious, readily available information tends to be the information we already know. Our final technique that I wanted to share with you today, and again, it could have kept going on this list, but I think this last one is particularly interesting. So far, the techniques I've talked about really are cognitive in the sense that they change how I think about information. They change how I search for information, how I interpret information. What's fascinating about the self-fulfilling prophecy is I start becoming the creator of information. With the self-fulfilling prophecy, for those who are unfamiliar with it, this is when I have an expectation and that will influence my actions, my behaviors in such a way that my actions or behaviors elicit the original expectations. For example, if I have the expectation that Doug is usually combative and really hostile during our interactions, and I have to go have a meeting with him, I might be going into that meeting expecting Doug to be a jerk as usual, right? Well, if I'm expecting Doug to be a jerk, I'm already on the defensive. He hasn't even said hello yet. And I'm getting ready to defend against his expected attacks. That's probably not going to make me the most friendly of companions in that conversation. In fact, my expectations of Doug being hostile and combative might lead me to be kind of hostile and combative. And Doug's probably going to pick up on that. And Doug's probably going to change his behaviors, wondering, why is Randy like being such a jerk right now? What is happening? He might be put on the defensive. And the funny part is, I see that whole interaction go down from my point of view. And I step back and say, see, I knew it. I knew Doug was going to be a complete jerk. I knew he was going to be hostile towards me. I knew I should have trusted my initial intuition, my initial expectations. So again, we have a lot of techniques that help us seek out information that is going to preserve what we know, that help us form and manipulate information so it supports what we already know, and even create some of that information to protect what we already know. The problem is that's going to keep us from moving forward, isn't it? That's going to keep us on that treadmill. And while I guess that's a good way to work out, that's probably not a good way to run a society stuck on a treadmill. So how do we move forward? I tried to generate just some suggestions for you all as audience members, things that you can think about in your own life. And they all kind of revolve around this idea, as my daughter is fond of saying. So my 7-year-old daughter will often share with me the lesson, mistakes are how we learn. And I love that message because it speaks to the idea that being wrong is okay. Being wrong will happen. When I am hammering nails in, invariably, I am going to screw up one of them and they're going to go in crooked. And it's fine. Being wrong is not necessarily the problem. It's being unable to admit we're wrong that becomes problematic for us as individuals and us as society. Another aspect we really need to keep in mind is that knowledge is going to change. From an individual standpoint, I truly, sincerely hope, as all of you have continued to learn throughout your lifetime, your knowledge has accumulated. It has changed over time. The information running around your head today might not have been the same information you had a couple of weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, or a couple of years ago. So hopefully our individual knowledge is increasing and changing over time. And hopefully our collective knowledge is changing over time. As we as human beings collect and accumulate knowledge through our different disciplines, we're going to have to appreciate that this collective knowledge is different than the collective knowledge we had a few years ago, or a few decades ago, or a few centuries ago. That collective knowledge will change. And that means as new information comes in, I might have to look back on those past selves and say, oops, I got it wrong. But that's okay, because I have new information. New information has come to light. New knowledge has come to light. I now realize that what I had done before was wrong. And related to that, when we realize we're wrong, we have to appreciate that that wrongness, that has nothing to do with whether you are a good person or a bad person. So wrongness is not a judgment of the quality of who we are. So really separating that experience of being wrong from our ego, recognizing that I can be wrong and my ego can still survive. It doesn't have to take a hit. When I can appreciate that wrongness is not a judgment of my value. Likewise for others, trying to be compassionate towards others, which I realize can be hard some days, right? When we feel like, oh, they're so wrong. How do they not see it? How can they not understand how wrong they are? Sometimes being compassionate towards them and understanding they're still in the treadmill right now. They're still putting in their time and effort on that treadmill. And maybe when they're ready to get off that treadmill and get some new information, to be there to offer them that information, to not judge them as a human being, but rather to educate them as a fellow citizen and a fellow human being on this planet. And finally, I think we need to appreciate that we waste a lot of time on treadmills, not the actual treadmills. That's fantastic. If you're on actual treadmills, working out, staying in shape, good stuff these days, keeps you healthy. We waste a lot of time on hypothetical treadmills. We waste a lot of time protecting our egos, and that keeps us as individuals from learning. That keeps us as a society from learning and moving forward. In other words, us being so invested in defending our ego keeps us from having a healthy democracy that can move forward in the future. I want to thank you all for listening and open up to questions.
Thank you, Randy. And yes, please do put questions in the chat. We have a couple already, and I'd be glad to present them to Randy, but please keep adding questions as you think of them. First one, Randy, is with what feels like a rise in entrenched thinking, how can we encourage people to open themselves up to new information?
I think that's a great question. I think part of it is being a model of that. I can tell you myself, it's hard for me to sometimes look at myself and say, oops, I screwed up, because I have the same issues that all humans are going to run into. I want to protect that ego. So sometimes knowing that rather than hitting your head against that wall, trying to convince someone they're wrong, sometimes the easier, more subtle method, granted the one that's going to require you to be patient, is to show them what it looks like to say, huh, oops, I got that wrong. That's fine. I'm just going to change how I've been thinking. So modeling kind of that self-compassion, and modeling that recognition of wrongness in ourselves, um, oftentimes will get you more progress than trying to argue with someone that they're wrong. Because remember, they've got that whole toolbox ready to defend themselves. You'll waste a lot of your time and energy. And frankly, even from a self-care standpoint, I often have this conversation with students in my multicultural awareness class, because they walk away and they're like, but how do I convince my parents? How do I convince my grandparents? How do I convince my family? This is not necessarily about trying to persuade others. Give them the information, open the door, let them keep running on the treadmill until they get tired and are willing to get off and listen to that information.
Thank you. And related to our topic for today, Randy, I'm talking specifically about democracy. Is there something specific to a democratic form of governance that either lends itself to working with these biases, or which is resistant to some of the biases in ways that maybe a more authoritarian or other kind of form of government might not be?
I wouldn't say it's resistant, because these tend to be biases that you're going to see fairly cross-culturally. They're fairly like human biases that show up. So I don't know that necessarily having a specific kind of government is going to make us less or more resistant to these biases. But I think the value in appreciating them in a democracy is just recognizing that we have a voice as citizens, we have a vote as citizens. And when we are not engaging in critical thinking, when we're kind of entrenched in our own ways, when we're making some of these biases that I had brought up earlier, that certainly can have harm for me as the individual. It can have harm for other individuals, but it really does harm our ability as a society to think critically. So I would say to some degree, and I'd be willing to debate this or see it from another perspective, certainly. From my perspective, I feel like in a democracy, it's almost our responsibility to understand these biases so that we can correct for them. We're never going to be able to get rid of them entirely, but being aware of them, correcting for them, engaging in that critical thinking, I feel is our responsibility as members of a democracy.
Great. We just got another really good question, I think, and this is how do you handle a situation with a friend who does not like to admit they're wrong and will constantly fight with you because they do not want to admit that they are wrong in a sense? So how do we respond in situations like that? Are there mechanisms for overcoming those biases?
Yeah, I think one of the two big suggestions I would make, one is about self-care, one is about kind of interpersonal relationship care. Um, in terms of self-care, as I mentioned earlier, I've gotten in those arguments with people that I'm like, how are you not seeing how wrong you are right now? What is happening? And I can try and calmly explain things. But there reaches a point where I'm probably just slamming my head against a wall. And I need to understand my job. I actually run into this, I feel, a lot as a professor. I don't know if other professors ever feel this way. I'm starting to appreciate that my job is not to persuade everyone to see life my way. My job as a professor is to lay information out there and say, here you go. Here's the information, do with it what you will. And I think that strategy, it has helped me in some of my interpersonal relationships, just realizing that, you know what, I can give you information. If you want to keep being wrong, that's on you. It's not on me. So it becomes a little bit of a self-care issue that we need to sometimes walk away from a debate, which leads me into the interpersonal relationship aspect. We need to sometimes recognize that if the relationship is truly important to us, I might have to just overlook that person being wrong. I mean, assuming that person is not doing harm to me or others, that it's a healthy relationship worth preserving, then sometimes I need to accept, okay, they're not going to see it my way. I'm going to love them as they are with all of their flaws, because I'm sure they love me as I am with all of my flaws. Sometimes it becomes a matter of I'm going to walk away from that battle. One of my students, Kayla Truxon, great student, psych student, mentioned this, gave me this bit of advice actually last semester in our multicultural awareness class. And I thought it was just the greatest piece of advice. And she's like, sometimes you have to learn to love people from afar. And I'm like, that's a really good point. I can still love someone even if they're wrong. Sometimes I need to put some distance, even just temporarily, distance between myself and that other person to take care of myself and allow them to kind of do their treadmill thing. And we can come back and still love each other, even though we disagree and have different opinions and different ideas.
Great. Just got another question. I think that will go to your other sets of interest in multicultural affairs as well. What individuals or cultures come to mind for you when you think about people who do a good job of embracing being wrong or learning from it?
I would say, because I saw someone had brought up the idea of collective versus individualistic societies. I will say, because I think this tends to be a lot of people are like, oh, collective societies, they all get along. And so that's got to be the best way to go. There is still prejudice and oppression in collective societies. So it's not that they are not without their faults. But I think the disadvantage that individualistic societies face is we're just more invested in protecting the ego, because we've kind of been taught and told that the individual has power, the individual is responsible and can make their own way in life. And I think that is a really empowering message and a nice message. But it also puts all of the responsibilities for my failures directly on me. And as anyone who has gotten that paper back where they had red marks all over their paper, we know that when we get that paper back, we feel bad. We feel like we are less of a person. So we have been really well taught to fear wrongness. But when we are also so invested in us as individuals and protecting our ego as individuals, we become just terrified of wrongness. We become really entrenched and stuck in those ways of trying to prove we're right and trying to avoid being wrong, which has a lot of consequences, again, for us as individuals and us just as members of society.
So can you think of any individuals you would point us to or cultures and say, well, this is a practice or this is an individual who is able to embrace being wrong and learn from it, or teach others to embrace being wrong and learn from it?
I guess what I often think of, and this is not by any means an exhaustive list of all of the cultures or individuals getting it right, but there's actually a religious practice, like I think of some practices within Buddhism, this idea of humility, and just recognizing that, yes, we're going to get it wrong some days, and that's okay, and kind of freeing ourselves from that self-criticism, as well as freeing others from that criticism, being okay when someone gets it wrong rather than trying to go after them, show them the same humility that you would want to show yourself. So I wouldn't say they're necessarily getting it 100% perfect, but I really do like that aspect of humility that shows up again in some religious practices.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, and I think this is a really wonderful question. I think that this is the question. I think that our for-profit healthcare system needs to be reformed. Some Americans believe that we should not look at European universal healthcare models because the belief that America is superior. Is American exceptionalism an example of America not being able to accept their faults? And what would it take for more of a country to realize that we're unable to look at other models?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say kind of that belief that, America as a country is invulnerable, kind of this assumption of moral superiority does get us in a lot of trouble because it tends to put us up on this high pedestal. And anytime you start feeling that pedestal shake a little bit, we get nervous as Americans and we go into defense mode, which keeps us using those techniques I was talking about earlier. It keeps us on that treadmill and it keeps us away from understanding and exploring new ideas. Like even the idea of mental set that I brought up earlier. When we get so stuck in our strategies and we're like, well, this strategy has always worked for our country. Why should we try something new? Well, because there could be new strategies out there and it doesn't have to be kind of the European model. There could be other new, creative, innovative ideas that we're not seeing because we're stuck on our treadmill.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So I appreciate, Randy, this has been wonderful. And I appreciate your taking the time to talk with us about this. I'm hoping that we will continue these conversations over the year to come. Tomorrow, we have a wonderful opportunity to hear Dr. Kay McAdams, who's an associate professor of history and the director of our general education program, as well as a fellow for interdisciplinary learning and integrative learning at your college. She will be speaking about this. She writes, in American politics, we tend to shorthand ways borrowed from historical reference points to understand and explain what is happening. In what is happening now, references to fascism and Nazism or neo-Nazism are used to describe attempts to subvert democracy in America. Historical reference points such as 1923, 1932, and 1933 Germany are also invoked as the basis for warning. How much, though, do we understand about how the Nazis came to power in a democratic system? What might we consider as possible lessons? And I will tell you that Dr. McAdams knows a good deal about that, and she can take on those questions with us, again, from a different lens. We've heard from a rhetorical lens. Today, we heard from a psychological lens. Tomorrow, we'll be able to discuss similar questions from the lens of a noted historian. So we're really excited and hope you can join us. We also hope you'll spread the word to others to join us for the rest of this series and suggest future series that we might hold from the Center for Community Engagement. So with that, thank you, Randy, and thank you to all the participants. And we hope to see you tomorrow. Take care.